Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Phyllis Dickerson, the CEO of the African American Mayors Association. We represent about 500 African American mayors around the U.S. And we have the pleasure of being with one of them today, which is Mayor Michael Hancock out of Denver. Welcome, Mayor Hancock. And Stephanie Young, of course, most of you probably already know her with her work around When We All Vote. And Lozada, we also have the CEO of Democracy Works. And so we're going to have a quick conversation, and we may be able to take a question from the floor at the end. So, Mayor Hancock, let's get started with you. I know you've done some work with Cities Ignite, and I want you to just share a little bit about your work on voting rights. And I know you're hosting an event in Houston upcoming at the National Nonpartisan Conversation on Voters' Rights. You did it in Denver, and now you're getting ready to do it in Houston. So tell us why you're doing this work and why is it so important?
Well, Phyllis, first of all, it's good to be with you. It's good to be at the Smart City Summit or Expo here in Miami. You don't have to invite me twice to come to Miami, so I'm glad to be here. And I'm glad to be sharing the stage with Stephanie and Luis about what I consider to be one of the most important civil rights issues in America today. These efforts that are happening around the country to suppress the very fundamental value of democracy, the right to vote, is something that, quite frankly, suffocated me while I was sitting at home watching it. Colorado is known as the gold standard in terms of access to voting. But as I was watching what was happening after the 2019 election, over 3/4 of the states in this country in 2021 proposed legislation to further suppress the right to vote. In 2022 alone, there have been 18 different states that have proposed legislation. And we are just the product of people who bled, fought, and died for the right to vote, and to see those laws being rolled back by states across the country were really, really concerning to me. And so, yeah, we got involved. And sitting in Colorado was not a safe haven for me. This is about our democracy. This is about the very fundamental right that many of my ancestors died for. And I felt compelled to get engaged. And so I talked with mayors across the country, other local officials, and we said we got to get involved. We can't sit still and idle and watch this happen. And so we started convening our local officials, the people who actually administer elections, and said, what can we do to ensure people's access to the ballot box? And so that's what we're focused on. We started in Denver, and you were there last year. After I leave here on Sunday, I will head to Houston, where Sylvester Turner is hosting a follow-up and a release of the playbook that started in Denver. And we'll spend 3 days there meeting with local officials from around the country doing the same thing.
Thank you. Thank you. So for those of you who are in the audience and you want to go to Houston, I promise you it is an event worth attending. So Stephanie, I know you have done the work on the ground about voter suppression and that kind of thing. I hate to think that if I hand somebody a bottle of water while they're in line getting ready to vote, that I could be arrested. So can you talk about the work you guys are doing around voter suppression?
Yeah, so I'm super excited to be here with all of you. And as Mayor Hancock just said, about all the voter suppression bills that we've seen around the country, we're talking about 500 bills that have been introduced and or passed in places like Florida, Georgia, my home state, Texas, and we're talking about really silly things, but it targets Black and brown communities. It targets people with voters with disabilities. It targets young people. And what you spoke about, especially in Georgia, we did a whole bunch of work when it came to our parties at the polls, because we know that when people vote together and they do it at a celebratory event, voting increases. And so they know that as well. So simple things just like handing people food or water or creating a celebratory event is threatened. In addition to that, it's decreasing early voting days. I was on a call today with the women in the AME church who are planning to do work with us. And Souls to the Polls is something that we know has worked year after year after year after year. But if you're rolling back these early voting days, you are really stopping Black and brown people from voting. So this is targeted. This is blatant. So we have to be as targeted and have to be as blatant with our work. So that's why we're digging in overtime. Next week is National Voter Registration Day, and we will be hosting events all around the country to get as many people as we can registered. We know bad habits remain with most folks, so people wait till the last minute, and the last minute to get registered is honestly the next couple of weeks. So we've led a concerted effort to push people to fight for voting rights and fight for voting rights legislation, but at the same time, we're still in communities through our voting squads, our chapter leaders. We have so much energy on the ground and training people to register the people in their lives, their communities, because we also know that you're the best influencer. It's not, Michelle Obama started When We All Vote, so it's not just Michelle Obama, it's you that makes that impact.
So, Louis, the name of your organization is Democracy Works. Does democracy really work?
That's like the number one joke that gets told to me every time I appear anywhere. Good afternoon, everybody. Democracy does work. And even when you see insidious things like voter suppression, those are policy decisions, and policy are born out of elected officials. And, you know, it's kind of a pithy statement, but folks kind of deserve the government that they vote for. And the issue that we try to address at Democracy Works is when there are groups such as When We All Vote, or all the organizations that are the voting rights space, they need support, they need technology support, and they need data. And Democracy Works is rooted in data. And our goal is to have the best possible data to support the electorate. And we do this by programs such as the Voting Information Project, of which Colorado is a participant. Many folks don't know this, but elections are not national. They're very local in nature, and you're dealing with 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 different elections and 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 different election offices, many of which are rural, are not getting funded. And they don't have the resources, these election administration officials, to get just simple data out to the electorate, such as where to vote, your polling location data, how to vote. Mayor Hancock, you were referencing legislation. Well, that legislation changes the rules of voting every cycle. And if you're just a run-of-the-mill individual that I voted this way last time, but they changed the rules of the game on you in the interim, where do you get that information? That is our job at Democracy Works. We have a page called How to Vote, which is literally how-to.vote, and you visit there, click on your state, and it gives you the rundown. But those data points, that information is also sourced by the largest distribution partners in the world. Google. If you Google, where is my polling location, that information is coming from Democracy Works. Microsoft Bing, you go in there asking for your polling location, that's coming from Democracy Works. So that's how we support democracy and support the electorate, by making sure that we're sourcing the most reliable, trusted information and making sure that we put it out through as many different publishers as possible. Because that's how I believe you make democracy work. Getting information, trusted information out to the electorate. Mis and disinformation are probably the largest threats. And we've seen some of this nonsense like text your vote after Election Day, some of the things that try to attack or take advantage of voters that are not hip to voting all of the time. That's where we try to step into that breach. We support election administration officials, we support voters, and we support big technology that gets reliable and trusted information about voting out to the electorate.
So, Mayor Hancock, I know cities don't actually run the election process, but what can mayors do in their cities to help their constituents make sure they have access to the voting?
Mayors, as well as in some cities or metro areas, have very strong county commissioners who have something that equals or rivals the governor and the legislature, and that is the bully pulpit. Number one is to raise awareness, to work with partners like Democracy Works, to work with When We All Vote, to raise awareness about the importance of registering to vote, number one, and two, getting out the vote, and so we can push those efforts. Thirdly is to raise awareness about the rules of voting and how we circumvent those efforts to suppress and to make sure that we push back as much as we can. You know, I think, for example, this room ought to be packed. Houston should be packed. Every conversation about the efforts to suppress voting ought to be packed with people, because it is the very foundation of who we are as a nation. And when we strip that away from people, we are threatening the very pillars of democracy. And the reality is that we can't sit back and watch this happen and not be anxious about doing everything we can to push back on it. And so we've got to ignite, we've got to raise awareness, we've got to let people know what legislatures in their state are trying to do, and do everything we can to remove those legislators who really believe it's important to suppress people's right to vote. Let's talk about some examples. This stuff is not hitting. This is to the point that's been made here. This stuff is blatant. It's bold. In Houston, Texas, where we're headed, Houston, Texas is one of the largest cities in this country. Prior to the new law in Texas being implemented, there were 24 drop-off locations around Houston. There's one today. If you don't think that impacts low-income people, people who are mobility restricted, people who may, be living with disabilities, you have just impacted a large percentage of your community and their ability to vote. Legislatures and cities ought to be working to add more voting locations, more drop-off locations than pulling back locations. And so that's why we're going into the heat of Texas. And we're going to speak very boldly, loudly, and clearly that what's happened here is wrong. And we're going to try to equip mayors and county commissioners and other local officials who may not run elections but certainly administer elections to help people to vote. And we can make sure we deal with this while at the same time sending a message to the voting public. We've got to go back to that legislature, remove those who don't believe what we don't believe in terms of the very pillar of democracy, and get people in place who believe that fundamentally every human being who reaches the age of 18, who has a legal right to vote, should be able to vote, and we ought to make sure every barrier is removed for that right to be exercised.
And you guys, to put that in perspective for you, to tell you how big Houston is, of the top 4 cities in the U.S. based on population, they're number 4.
Yeah.
So, and of the top 4 cities around the U.S., 3 of them are run by African-American mayors. So that would be New York, Chicago, and Houston. The only one we don't have right now is L.A.
Yeah.
So, Stephanie.
But we're talking about landmass, though, of Houston, right? We all know how large Houston. You can travel for hours and still be in the city of Houston and not realizing. That's the thing we're talking about here, is getting people across town at a one drop-off location, or they just don't vote. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
So, Stephanie, I know we both had the pleasure of working with Mrs. Obama. My role was totally different from yours. But can you tell us, why is this work important to her? She's not running for office, not yet.
She's not. She's not ever.
And so why is this work so important to Mrs. Obama?
Yeah, so When We All Vote was launched in 2018. And obviously, after spending that entire 8 years in the White House, experiencing midterm elections where voter turnout dropped significantly, and seeing people excited to vote in 2008 and again in 2012, she knew right then and there we have to do something about the way people think about this democracy themselves and voting. So our whole mission is to change the culture around voting so that we're increasing participation in each and every election by closing the race and the age voting gap. And when we talk about culture, it's a myriad of things, right? It's not just, pop culture. That's a big proponent of the work that we do because we want to make sure that we are in the cultural zeitgeist. But it's also the culture of a corporation who doesn't think that they should talk about voting rights because it's partisan. Voting is not partisan. So it's changing the way in which we think about democracy. And beyond that, it is us not attaching our involvement to a figure that we like or that we love. It's bigger than President Barack Obama. It's bigger than President Joe Biden. It's bigger than any figure. And I think we can see now when you attach yourself to one figure, things could be really crazy and people are attacking capitals and doing weird things. So we have to be very, very careful about how we look at this government and this democracy. And it cannot be attached to one party, one person, one personality. It cannot, because it cannot be sustainable. Because people think I'm going to tap in, but then I'm going to tap out. And I love to say that democracy is a two-player sport. And we're all in the field, and politicians are on one side. No, you're a good mayor. And we as voters are on another side, right? And if we're never on the field, well, another side is always going to win. And we have to also think about it as an investment, just like we're putting money into the bank every month, or we should be, or we're investing in our health by working out, or investing, in our children by sending them to school. These are long-term investments. Voting is a long-term investment in democracy, and we're obsessed with this instant gratification that I voted for this one person, so everything should be fixed. I voted for this one president, so everything should change. That is not how it works. So we're trying to help people understand how government works, how it impacts their lives, and how voting is in the middle of that. And every issue is a voting issue, from reproductive justice to climate change. It all starts at voting. So you can't have one pet issue that you care about and ignore voting. It just doesn't work.
Thank you, thank you. So, Lewis, I know we were talking backstage, and I told Lewis I've been going to the same polling site since I was 4. So my mother used to take me. We used to get out the car at Archview Baptist Church, and Miss Llewellyn would be standing outside saying, "Vote for the hood, Doris, vote for the hood." And I couldn't wait to be 18, and I got out of my car, and she said, "Vote for the hood, Phyllis, vote for the hood." I was like, "I got you." And so I said all that to say, I just found out a few months ago that my polling site has been changed. And I just happened to call on a fluke, right? Just to make sure. And you know, we're college educated people, but what about those folks that get to the polling site, they stand in line all that time, and then they're told, "Oh, your polling site has been changed," right? And they've been there for, you know, I'm almost 60, so they've been at that polling site a long time, right? And so tell us about some of the voter information tools and things that are out there that people in the audience can even share to make sure that not only themselves, but their family members, their church members, faith-based, everybody has the same information.
Absolutely, and Mayor Hancock drew attention to what's happening or what's happened in Houston coming out of the 2020 election, where you close the drop box locations. We just had legislation in the state of Wisconsin that unless the ballot drop box is inside the elections office, it is per se illegal. The rules of voting change every federal election cycle, and as I described earlier, we stay on top of that. We've got something called the Voting Information Tool. It's a widget. It's embeddable on any website. The When We All Vote website uses the voter information tool. On top of that, as I mentioned, we have that relationship with large search engines, ensuring that when you Google, "Where do I vote? Where is my polling location?" we're letting you know about that. We also have our own website, gettothepolls.com. But the voting information tool, it's not just about your polling location. It's about early voting sites, early polling locations, drop box sites, the ones that are still available for dropping your ballot off. And it's available in 13 different languages, because we also have to consider the diverse electorate that we have in this country and ensuring that the information is accessible to all voters. So our largest distribution channels are going to be organizations such as When We All Vote, independent of the search engines. But then we also prop up whichever website we can for corporate partners. We administer a program called the Civic Alliance that works with over 1,300 corporations, where we set up voter registration campaigns for them. But we also ensure that if they need information to be distributed to their stakeholders, that embeddable tool is there. So that's what we do. We try to make our data ubiquitous, put it out there everywhere, because we want to make sure that once you've gotten past the emotion and the excitement of getting registered to vote, it doesn't just stop there. You actually have to make it to the polling location. And then, in addition to the voter information tool, we also have a service that tracks ballots via the mail. We use United States Postal Service data, and for jurisdictions and the ones that I referenced earlier, which are not as well resourced, not every city is Denver that can afford to use a big vendor to do their ballot tracking. We offer a low-cost solution for those jurisdictions so that they can offer their voters the ability to track their ballot on its way to their home and then on the return route back to the election office. It's about using technology and data, whichever way possible, to make voting as simple and as accessible as we possibly can.
Love it. If I can add something, what we have today prior to 1965, right, that's different from prior to 1965, is technology, awareness, and engagement. And much, much more. But the reality is there's something fourth that's missing here that we have got to ignite as well. And that is through the Generation X, the millennial generations, and Generation X, whatever the names are these days, Z. We've got to instill the sense of obligation and responsibility. And I think, Louis, that's where you were going with regards to not only register, but now you got to vote. And when I talk to my children, I remember the 2016 election. All my children are adults and were of voting age. And I remember talking about voting. And they said, well, I don't have anyone in which to vote for. Obama wasn't on the ballot. So they weren't excited. And we saw what happened in 2016 because a lot of people weren't excited about either candidate. And so we elected someone who should have never sniffed the White House, a blade of grass at the White House for that matter, whether it was transported to New York or to Florida. He should have never smelled the White House. And the reality is that, to your point, we live who we elected. And the bottom line is we've got to instill in our young people the sense of obligation and responsibility, black and brown in particular, to vote. That right people died for. And if I can just share this story, you saw this when we were in Denver and we had a panel discussion just like this, and I sat in Phyllis's seat as the moderator, and in this seat where I sat was the historic Carlotta Walls Lanier. And she's one of the famed Little Rock Nine, who integrated Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. And my first question to her was, when you look across the landscape today and see all these efforts around voter suppression occurring, and you see us really being silent on what's happening around the country, what is your message to today's generation? And she responded without missing a beat, you dropped the baton. And that message, that's just that little sentence she gave, sent chill, just did it again, down my back. And that's where this energy comes from. That sense of obligation has got to be transferred to the generation saying, you didn't wake up on third base. Someone fought like hell to get you where you are today, and you owe it to not only them, but to the next generation to keep pushing and not let this happen.
Well, Phyllis, I don't want to take over, but I just want to respond to that because we are talking about data, and unfortunately, with the research that we've done, a lot of young people, they don't view voting as a responsibility. And so not the way that, I'm a millennial, I'm an older millennial, but I believe it's my responsibility, but that's the way I was raised. I saw my parents vote, right? I saw them be engaged. They took me to do those things. And my father was, a leader everywhere we were because he was a bishop in the AME church. So I understood that through my upbringing. But they don't feel that, think that. Now they think voting is a choice. So we're always in this conundrum of how are we going to help people make the choice to vote? It's not pleasant. It's not everybody either, too, right? But it's a lot of the younger generation feel like it's now a choice. And so we have to figure out how are we helping them make the choice by making it easy and accessible. And if you also think about it, we should be out of business. We shouldn't be doing this work. Why are we doing this? Why isn't the government doing this, right? They don't have the resources, the funding to do this. But there are countries all around the world, advanced democracies, that have figured this out. Automatic voter registration. Why are we registering to vote? If you're a citizen of this country, it doesn't make any sense. So I think that there's a lot to kind of dig through here, but I definitely just wanted to highlight the fact that was disappointing for me is that a lot of people are looking at voting as a choice and no longer as a responsibility or an obligation. But if you go down to Montgomery to Brian Stevenson's memorial for lynching, half or maybe even 2/3 of the reason why those people were lynched, it says tried to vote, got registered to vote, registered voters, amongst other things, but voting was one of the top reasons.
I'm so glad you guys brought that up, that I thought I was an anomaly, like going to vote with my mom at 4, right? And so that's so important. For those of you who know me, you know I actually attended undergrad with Scottie Pippen. And I tell this story all the time because our first 2 years in undergrad, Scottie was only 6'1". And so he didn't get a scholarship to play basketball. And so his best friend was actually on the team. So he showed up to practice every day. And so Coach Dyer let him be the waterboard and towel boy, right? But he showed up to practice every day. So he ran the drills with everybody as if he was on the team. So first thing, you got to show up to practice every day, right? And so between his sophomore and junior year, he shows up to my house that summer, and he's grown like 7 inches. And I said, what happened? Did your mom take you to the doctor? And in rural Arkansas, they don't take you to the doctor unless you're dying. So he was like, no. He's one of 11 kids, right? And so he gets back to school, and Coach Dyer sees now Scottie's 6'8". But Scottie's been practicing as a guard, right? So he ends up being on the team now. Now he gets a scholarship. He already knows all the drills. He already knows all the plays. But Scottie Pippen at 6'1" could not play for the Chicago Bulls. But Scottie Pippen at 6'8", even from an NAIA school, could end up getting drafted only because he kept showing up for practice. And so I guess our takeaway is keep showing up for practice. So Mayor Hancock, based on that, what's at stake in this next election? Like what really is at stake? We've survived COVID, monkeypox. We've gotten some money's on the way about our, deferring our loans and paying off our student loans. Thank God I only had $2,500 in student loans. We got Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown in. And so we saw a lot of things at stake in this past election cycle. So what's at stake?
Well, I think that's part of the problem is that, and I think Stephanie said it best, this is not a practice run. This is a lifelong journey in terms of securing democracy and equality in the process of this nation. That was the kind of satisfied breath of release that was happening after Obama's election. We made it. Oh, you got a black president, you made it. You got a black mayor, you're there. Stop pushing. And the reality is that this is a nation that still has to mature into itself, has to live up to the ideas of democracy and equality, and which means that we still have a long way to go. There used to be an old, and I got to find this thing because it was one of the most powerful documents I've ever read. Somebody wrote, if there was equality from day one in this nation, how many African Americans would have been in the C-suite? How many black presidents you would have had? How many female presidents you would have had by now? How many members of Congress other than white male you would have had? And it was astounding in terms of the income and wealth that would have been generated by communities other than where the income and wealth is concentrated today. But that's the ideal of America. And the reality is that we have a long way to go. And so when you say what's next, we got to keep going. We got to keep pushing. I'm excited as anyone that President Obama was elected. I'm excited that Kamala Harris is vice president and that we see the diversity of the cabinet that we're seeing today. And we're seeing wealth beginning to spread a little more. But we are nowhere near where we should be. I guess Jesse Jackson said it best. He said, we're not where we used to be, but we're a long way from where we want to be. And we still got work to do. And I think that's really the idea of America. Keep going, keep getting better, and striving for your highest ideal.
So, Stephanie, I heard Mayor Hancock bring up the great Little Rock Central High, which is where I graduated from high school in the Little Rock 9. So I had the pleasure one day of talking to Ernie Green during the 50th anniversary. And I asked Ernie, what made you go back the next day? After the mob came and they had to take you out the back door and all of that. What made you go back the next day? And he said, I was thinking, it must be something really good in there they don't want me to see. And so with that in mind, when I was planning that 50th anniversary, and to Michael's point, we're the two old people up here, Michael and I. Mayor Hancock and I are two old people up here, but you guys are the young people up here. What have we done a good job of passing the baton? What have you learned and, in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think that I think it's resilience. You mentioned the global pandemic and monkeypox and all the things that we've faced over the years. I remember 9/11 before I went to, I don't know if it was my senior year of high school, or I remember that day. My mom told me she always has on the news, and I was a little girl on the floor, and I said, is there ever going to be peace in the Middle East? Because they were talking about something happening. So we have experienced and seen so much in our lifetime, especially millennials, and so much change when it comes to technology and the way that we communicate and the way that this world works. And I had the privilege of working in the Obama White House, working on Capitol Hill, seeing how the seats of our government are formed and how they work together, or how they're dysfunctional. And I feel like I was there on Capitol Hill at the kind of right at the end when things just took a turn for the worse. Really pretty much right after Obamacare was signed into law, excuse me. So, I think that But what I've learned along the way is definitely resilience. I remember sitting in a meeting with President Obama and civil rights leaders and leaders within the Black Lives Matter movement. I put together almost like a changing of the guard meeting, or an old guard and new guard meeting, something that had never happened before. So people who were protesting, talking about we weren't doing enough, all of the things, right? With C.T. Vivian and John Lewis, and many others, and we were having an intergenerational conversation. That was literally potentially a passing of the baton with folks like Brittany Packnett and DeRay McKesson and others. And in that moment, President Obama, he said, look, what gives me energy is anything good that happens, big or small. I don't care how small it is, it's a win towards where we're going to go. And progress is incremental. And anything that we can do that is good, that moves the needle forward, is worth it. And I can tell you, it's hard waking up every day and doing this type of work, because it's frustrating on both sides, from what's happening to dealing with voter apathy and feeling the discouragement of American voters. But I think about that resonates in my mind all the time. Like, I don't care if it's one voter re-register or 200,000. It doesn't matter to me. It is good. And what we're doing is empowering people to understand their power in this democracy, and it's going to be worth it in the long run. And then I also have to think about my grandmother, who was born in 1913 to sharecroppers, who only got an 8th grade education. And I worked at the White House. That is, what, 2 generations? So we're not that far away from where we were, but we've taken a big leap. And that is something that's also has sustained me. And that is, for me, the baton that I feel like I'm taking. And there are some really good young people who are out here who are trying to do good work for our democracy as well.
So, Louis, I know you're one of those young people. So what have you learned through this process?
I don't know that I'm that young. I was already out of college September 11th. So, and I grow the gray to kind of remind people that it's I've seen better days. I don't know that I have anything to add to what Stephanie was describing. I mean, we're learning in real time that if you don't take control of your government, if you don't participate, then the government will take control of you, and you may not like what those outcomes are. It is embarrassing when we look at voter participation rates in countries outside the United States, and they've got 70, 80, 90%, and we're celebrating because we did 60%. And again, it's low expectations, and that's the kind of the lull that I think that the electorate has been in. But it isn't for lack of energy, because I believe that if you can have events, for example, like January 6th, where folks will get dressed up and climb a wall, there's certainly some energy out there, but is the energy being focused in the right direction? And if you think about it, it's a lot easier to register to vote, and then, well, I shouldn't say it's a lot easier to register to vote, given what we know. In many states, it can be as easy as you've been automatically registered, you get a ballot in the mail, you don't even have to get a stamp in some places, and you put it in a ballot box. I feel like that's a lot less effort than spending your time on social media and, getting all hopped up and all this other stuff. And I just wish that, again, if folks had that same level of attention to the details of government, civic education is a very big issue in this country. I mean, I grew up on PBS and really learning about social studies that way. Of how a bill becomes a law, that sort of thing. I don't know that we have that same sort of emphasis on it right now. There are powers that are making that, more so than others with book burning and whatnot. But, it's understanding the moment that you're in. And again, knowing that you are responsible for your fate. And I think that it's just been reinforced throughout my entire life. And then you probably hear a little bit of the frustration in my voice now. It's like, folks, let's wake up. Let's take control of our situation.
So I already told you that Mayor Hancock and I are like the old school kids on this panel. And so with that in mind, Mayor Hancock, we've seen a lot in our lifetime. But we have never seen what we saw on January 6th, right? So for me, January 6th was one of those moments in time that, like, I was in Little Rock at the time, and I was sitting in my bed, and my phone was blowing up from all my political friends that were in D.C., and I was like, where are you? Are you there? Get out. Da, da, da. And we're like playing this out in real time because now we have technology. So my question for you was, where were you and what were you thinking?
like you, I was at home and I was watching it on CNN and thinking to myself, what the hell is going on here? And you know, that transfers from what the hell is going on to this is not happening in the United States of America. It didn't, no. And I think as I watched it, the more I watched, the more I got good friends who are members of Congress, particularly, of course, members of our delegation. I'm worried about them, worried about their safety. And then you hear, of course, they're looking for Nancy Pelosi. We're hoping our speaker's okay. They're looking for the vice president. I'm hoping our vice president's okay. I'm like, what the hell is going on? And when you ask the question, is this happening in America? Who are we waiting on? The United States military. Where are they? Why haven't the National Guard showed up? And so that started resonating in my mind is what's going on here. This seems like something that was very orchestrated and very coordinated. And then I remember one thing, this is truly, and I'll stop at this, that came to mind. Stand back and stand by.
Wow. So Stephanie, where were you and
Yeah.
what were you thinking?
So I was home in Atlanta. I just moved from New York during COVID, and we were planning, because there was a runoff in Georgia, so we were planning all of the work that we were doing there to get people excited to vote again. We were planning a car. Literally, we had a drive-in concert, so people stayed in their cars, but we had like a real artist perform on stage. It was great. So that's what we were doing. I was planning that, and I remember watching the television and just being like, it was almost like an outer body experience. I'm like, is that really happening? And I think we're so desensitized to, because of all the violence we're consistently seeing and consuming from social media, that it didn't hit me at first. But then I was like, I've worked on Capitol Hill. I've worked for Democratic leadership. And I was harassed by Capitol Police, even though I worked there, and even Secret Service, even though I worked at the White House, on many occasions. And the fact that they were so close in that moment told me this is an inside job. And it was mind-boggling. I think what's been the most upsetting thing to me is a dismissal of it from many people. And acting like it didn't happen. It's not that big of a deal. Stop talking about it. Well, that tells us people don't understand democracy. That tells us we are slipping and we're sliding into a really dangerous place. But I was shell-shocked, and I'm really glad that the January 6th Commission is continuing. I'm really interested to seeing those text messages from the Secret Service, because I know it will reveal what we already probably know. I'm probably going too far in even saying that, but we have to address the moment for legitimacy going forward. Because if we don't, if there's no checks and balances, then why are we here? Why do we have a democracy? So it is a work in progress that I hope that all of us continue to pay attention to and be vigilant about, and don't let this drop.
So Lewis, where were you?
So we're in the era of working remotely, so I was at home. We had just gotten done with the Georgia runoff. Runoffs and special elections and things that happen after election day are like our superpower days, because a lot of people stop paying attention, and that's when we really have to ratchet up the amount of information that we get out to make sure that people are still participating. And because we're kind of eggheads at Democracy Works and we're into politics and all that stuff, you get that result the night before, and it's like, oh, wow, we impacted that. We knew the number of people that we had registering and accessing our tools within the state, so we're happy about that. And we're doing a lot of kind of debrief type conversations the next day. And I remember being on a Zoom call with a colleague, and I keep a television set in my office, and I'm watching this unfold, and it's wild. I started talking to my mom about it. My mom was born in the Dominican Republic, and I'm talking like, can you believe this? And she's like, what do you mean? What is so special about the United States? This happens in other places. What would you expect here? And that's what like really hit home with me. I'm like, again, this feeling of exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, we got to deal with the same situations that you have to deal with outside of the United States in lesser evolved democracy, if that's a term, if you don't mind your store. So I really just take it as like, you know what? This is what we deserve. because you don't participate, and it just redouble your work. So get back on that Zoom call and get to working on 2021, because there are no off years in elections. That's when you have local government and mayor's races and all that stuff. It's not just about the presidentials. It's not just about Congress. Local elections are just as, if not more important in many respects, because they're the ones that are setting up the infrastructure or not setting up the infrastructure for your election.
Mayor Hancock, we know you're leaving office next year. Wow. Wow. So if you could only do one more thing, get one more thing accomplished before leaving office next year, what would that one thing be?
Well, I don't know if it's accomplished before I leave office. Obviously, there are things in Denver that I'll do that none of you would be very much interested in before I leave. But I think nationally, you know, one of my prayers is, Lord, tell me and show me what is my next calling or the thing that I should be engaged in. This is it. I've always, since a little kid, like Luis, grew up watching historic figures, watching, PBS and Sesame Street and so on and so forth about democracy, about how a bill becomes a law. So political stuff is something I care a great deal about. And I've been all over the world. I've been blessed to go all over the world. So I know how exceptional the United States is and how unique we are as an experiment. And if we don't get a hold of it, we're going to muck it up, unfortunately. And I want my grandkids to be able to enjoy the exceptionalism of this nation, just like we have been able to be blessed with it. But it's got to live up to his ideals. So the bottom line is I'm going to stay involved in this voter rights issue. I believe that's my calling. And just like Esther, who knows, maybe all of us have been called to a time such as this. And we now have figured out what our purpose is beyond being the mayor, beyond going into the private sector and doing what we hope to do later on, but a blessing to our society, and that is to make sure that we carry on the mantle and pick up the baton that Carlotta Lanier had, that Ernie Green had, and that the leaders in Atlanta had, and Martin Luther King had, and say, you know what, we owe it to them, if anybody, to make sure we pick it up and advance it.
So, Stephanie, what's on your wish list for when we all vote?
My wish list, it's a lot. I really want When We All Vote to become the Planned Parenthood of civic engagement. When you think about Planned Parenthood, you understand what that means. You understand you can work with them to fight for reproductive justice. You know, you can go for, a wellness check. You know you can get resources and support there. So my long-term wish is that When We All Vote is that space and that home for civic engagement, and that partner to mayors and that partner to other voting organizations to continue to lift up this work. But my immediate wish list is that everybody signs up for a week of action, which is next week, and you join us and register voters in your own community. It's very simple. It is, because we do it on our phone in some places. It's simpler than others. And take part. Do your part with us. We try to make it easy and a low barrier to entry, but we also like to make it fun. And on September 19th, we're having a rally with Michelle Obama virtually, so please join us for that and get involved.
And Lois?
I have staff in the audience, so don't take this the wrong way, but organizational obsolescence. The fact that we need to exist is a problem. The fact that elections are not funded in this country in a way where you don't need to have a small nonprofit based out of Brooklyn, New York with 60 employees propping up elections, that's an issue. So I'd like to be a part of whatever comes after that obsolescence, but I think that, it's do-gooder work almost, because we're filling in gaps. I don't want to be the treatment. I want to be the cure, and that's where we're at right now. We have to improve the manner in which elections are run in this country.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Great conversation. And I guess I'll end with a quote with President Roosevelt. He said to educate a man's mind and not his morals is to educate a menace to society. And so we take away one word for this, which is my clutch bag, of course. Just vote. Thank you, everyone.